Part 1. It started as a 30-second clip, a blink and you miss it moment in America's endless media cycle, but what no one realized at first was that this tiny flash of video would ignite a cultural wildfire, pulling together politics, celebrity power, immigration, hypocrisy, and a nation already stretched to its breaking point. The lights of the Grammys were still glowing, champagne glasses still clinking, when a different kind of spotlight snapped on, harsh and unforgiving, exposing a contradiction that millions of Americans felt in their bones but rarely heard spoken out loud. On one side of the country, celebrities stood on polished stages, draped in designer clothes, lecturing America about compassion, justice, and open borders. On the other side, border agents worked through the night, overwhelmed, underfunded, and demonized, trying to hold a fragile line that felt like it was dissolving beneath their boots. And somewhere in between, a television camera rolled, capturing a blunt, unfiltered monologue that would ripple far beyond its original audience. The clip didn't shout. It didn't scream. It didn't beg for attention. It simply said what millions were already thinking. Jesse Waters leaned forward, eyes locked on the camera, and in that moment, the distance between Hollywood fantasy and American reality collapsed. He talked about immigration and customs enforcement, about ICE agents being vilified by the same elites who lived behind gates, guarded by private security, far removed from the consequences of the policies they praised. He talked about celebrities who fly private jets to award shows while demanding sacrifices from people who can barely afford gas. And he talked about the growing anger bubbling under the surface of a country tired of being talked down to. The words hit a nerve because they weren't new. They were familiar. They echoed kitchen table conversations, late-night rants, quiet frustrations shared between neighbors and coworkers. What made this different was timing. America was already raw. Trust in institutions was fragile. The border was a daily headline. And celebrity activism, once celebrated, was starting to feel hollow to a growing number of people. The Grammys had just wrapped. Cameras captured speeches about inclusion, diversity, and moral responsibility. Applause roared through the room. Social media filled with praise. But outside the velvet ropes, another reality played out. Cities struggled under the weight of migrant surges. Shelters overflowed. Local governments quietly begged for help. And ICE, the agency tasked with enforcing immigration law, found itself demonized as villains in a story far more complex than slogans allowed. Waters didn't frame it as a policy debate. He framed it as a question of honesty. Who pays the price? That question hung in the air long after the clip ended. Who pays when borders are treated like suggestions? Who pays when enforcement is mocked? Who pays when elites demand moral virtue without personal cost? For millions of viewers, the answer was obvious. It wasn't the celebrities. It wasn't the politicians. It was ordinary Americans living in border states, struggling cities, and working-class neighborhoods where the consequences of national decisions land first and hardest. The clip spread fast, shared in group chats, reposted on X, cropped, subtitled, stitched into reaction videos. Supporters called it refreshing truth. Critics called it inflammatory. But even critics couldn't deny its reach. The conversation had escaped the studio and entered the bloodstream of the country. What made it explosive wasn't just what was said, but what it represented. A shift. For years, celebrity activism had enjoyed near-automatic praise. Speak up, and you were brave. Question it, and you were heartless. But now, something was changing. Viewers were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Not about intentions, but about consequences. Why do the loudest voices rarely live with the outcomes? Why are ICE agents condemned by people who will never meet them? Why are working families expected to absorb costs while elites collect applause? These questions didn't come from think tanks. They came from lived experience. From communities watching resources stretched thin. From parents worried about safety. From workers watching wages stagnate while being told to feel guilty for wanting order. Waters' commentary acted like a match dropped into dry grass. The fire didn't start with him, but it spread because the ground was ready. And as the clip circulated, something else happened. People started digging deeper. They revisited old speeches, old celebrity statements, old interviews where the same voices now preaching compassion had once demanded walls, enforcement, and deportations when it suited them. The hypocrisy, once dismissed as partisan spin, began to look undeniable. At the same time, ICE agents remained largely invisible. No award shows, no standing ovations, no viral speeches. Just long hours, dangerous work, and a public narrative that painted them as monsters rather than men and women enforcing laws passed by elected officials. Waters put that contrast front and center. Glamour versus grit. Applause versus accountability. And then came the backlash. Commentators accused him of stoking division, of attacking artists, of simplifying a complex issue. But even those critiques struggled to blunt the impact, because the audience wasn't tuning in for nuance. They were tuning in for recognition. For someone to articulate what they felt but couldn't say without being labeled cruel or ignorant. The clip didn't change minds overnight. But it cracked something open. A permission structure. It told viewers it was okay to question celebrity authority. It was okay to ask whether moral signaling without sacrifice meant anything at all. And it was okay to support law enforcement without apology. Behind the scenes, media executives noticed the numbers. Politicians noticed the reaction. Celebrities noticed the comments turning less flattering. Something had shifted, and nobody knew yet how far it would go. Because this wasn't just about one monologue or one award show. It was about a broader reckoning. About who gets to define morality in America. About whether fame equals wisdom. About whether compassion can exist without chaos. And about whether a country can survive when accountability disappears behind applause. As the clip continued to circulate, another truth emerged. The anger wasn't just directed at celebrities. It was directed at a system that felt upside down. A system where enforcement was shameful and lawlessness was excused. Where border agents were vilified and virtue was measured by hashtags. Waters had touched a live wire, and the shock was still spreading. But this was only the beginning. Because once the conversation started, it didn't stay on television. It moved into city halls, school boards, dinner tables, and voting booths. It forced people to pick sides, not between left and right, but between reality and performance. And in the days that followed, as reactions grew louder and stakes grew higher, one question loomed larger than all the rest. What happens when the audience stops applauding? That question would drive everything that came next. Part 2. The morning after the clip went viral, America woke up to an unfamiliar silence from places that were usually loud. Celebrity social feeds slowed. Publicists scrambled. Talk shows teased segments they hadn't planned. The night before, something about this moment felt different, heavier, like a pressure system settling over a culture that had spent years floating on slogans. Inside newsrooms, producers replayed the clip again and again, not because it was outrageous, but because it was effective. It landed. Focus groups lit up with comments that startled even seasoned analysts. Viewers didn't describe the monologue as angry. They described it as honest. That single word kept appearing, over and over, cutting through the noise. Honest. The conversation shifted almost immediately. It was no longer about whether celebrities had the right to speak. Everyone agreed they did. The question became whether they should be treated as moral authorities when they never lived with the consequences of the policies they promoted. That distinction mattered, and for the first time in years, it was being openly discussed without whispers. Local radio hosts picked it up first. Callers flooded the lines, voices tight with emotion. Border state residents described towns transformed overnight. Teachers talked about overcrowded classrooms. Nurses spoke about emergency rooms stretched thin. Truck drivers described routes that no longer felt safe after dark. These weren't ideological arguments. They were lived realities, finally given oxygen. ICE agents listened quietly. For years, they had worked under a cloud of public hostility, their job framed as cruelty rather than enforcement. Many avoided mentioning their profession at social gatherings. Some stopped wearing uniforms off duty. Others watched their children come home from school asking why their parent was called a monster online. The clip didn't glorify their work, but it acknowledged it, and that acknowledgement felt rare enough to matter. Meanwhile, Hollywood responded the only way it knew how, defensively. A handful of celebrities fired back online, accusing critics of fearmongering, of lacking compassion, of turning human suffering into political talking points. But the tone had shifted. The replies beneath their posts were no longer universally supportive. Questions appeared. Tough ones. Who pays for housing? Who funds schools? Who absorbs the strain when systems break? The comments weren't cruel. They were practical, and practicality is often the enemy of performance. Late-night shows attempted humor, but the laughs sounded thinner. Satire works best when the audience agrees on the premise. This time, the premise was cracking. Writers sensed it. Hosts sensed it. The jokes landed, but they didn't linger. Behind closed doors, political strategists paid closer attention. Polling data showed something unexpected. Support for border enforcement was rising, not in ideological terms, but in emotional ones. Voters expressed exhaustion. Not anger alone, but fatigue. Compassion fatigue. Outrage fatigue. A deep weariness from being told that asking questions made them bad people. The clip had given them permission to be curious again. And curiosity, once unleashed, is dangerous to narratives built on silence. Journalists began revisiting footage from previous years. Old interviews resurfaced, showing some of the loudest celebrity voices once advocating for stronger borders when it aligned with popular opinion. The contrast was stark. The internet did what it always does when it smells inconsistency. It archived. It compared. It remembered. What followed wasn't a coordinated backlash, but a slow erosion of credibility. The kind that doesn't explode in scandal but drains authority drop by drop. The aura of moral certainty dimmed, replaced by skepticism. Not hostility, just doubt. At the same time, cities bearing the brunt of migration pressure grew louder. Mayors who once echoed national talking points quietly adjusted their language. Requests for federal assistance multiplied. Emergency declarations expanded. The gap between rhetoric and reality widened until it could no longer be ignored. And still, the question lingered. Who pays the price? Every policy has a bill. That bill doesn't disappear because intentions are good. It gets passed along, deferred, shifted downward until it lands on those with the least power to refuse it. The clip had named that truth without apology, and now the country was forced to look at the invoice. Social media analysts noticed another trend. The clip resonated most strongly with younger viewers, not older ones. This surprised many. Gen Z and younger millennials, raised on constant messaging about compassion and inclusivity, were pushing back, not against empathy, but against performative empathy. They wanted solutions, not symbolism. Order, not chaos. Systems that worked, not slogans that felt good. That generational shift alarmed activists who had assumed cultural dominance was permanent. Inside government agencies, morale shifted subtly. Not dramatically. No celebrations. Just a quiet sense that the public narrative might not be permanently hostile. That recognition mattered. Law enforcement, like any institution, responds to perception. When legitimacy erodes, effectiveness follows. When legitimacy is restored, even slightly, it changes behavior, confidence, and resolve. Still, resistance remained fierce. Advocacy groups warned that the conversation risked dehumanizing migrants. They weren't wrong to raise the concern. But their warnings collided with another reality: communities felt dehumanized too. Their struggles minimized. Their safety concerns dismissed. Their questions labeled immoral. The tension wasn't between compassion and cruelty. It was between competing claims of humanity. And neither side wanted to surrender moral ground. Cable news turned the clip into a battlefield. Panels argued past each other. Chyrons screamed simplified narratives. But viewers were tuning out the shouting. They had already heard what mattered to them. The rest felt like theater. The real shift was happening quietly, in private conversations. Families debating without fear of cancellation. Friends admitting doubts they'd buried. Voters reconsidering assumptions they'd inherited. These were not dramatic moments, but they were foundational ones. Because cultural change rarely announces itself. It seeps. As days passed, Jesse Waters' clip became less about him and more about what it unlocked. It stopped being a talking point and became a reference. Remember that clip? People would say, before launching into deeper discussions about borders, enforcement, responsibility, and honesty. And that scared the people who benefited most from the old script. When narratives control discussion, power is centralized. When discussion opens up, power diffuses. This moment wasn't a revolution, but it was a redistribution of conversational authority. Ordinary people felt heard, and once that happens, it's hard to push them back into silence. The Grammys felt far away now. The glamour faded. The speeches echoed hollowly against unfolding reality. The contrast between red carpets and real consequences grew sharper by the hour. And as policymakers prepared for the next legislative battles, as activists recalibrated messaging, and as celebrities debated whether to double down or retreat, one thing became clear. The audience had changed. They weren't clapping on cue anymore. They were listening, weighing, questioning. And that meant the story was far from over. Because when people stop applauding and start asking questions, the next phase isn't performance. It's accountability. And accountability was coming. Part 3. Accountability arrived quietly at first, not with dramatic headlines or fiery speeches, but with subtle shifts in language, posture, and priorities. Politicians who once spoke in absolutes began adding qualifiers. Press secretaries stopped using moral grandstanding and started emphasizing logistics. Words like capacity, funding, enforcement, and coordination replaced the softer language of symbolism. The change wasn't announced. It was felt. In border communities, the mood remained tense but attentive. Residents noticed increased patrols in some areas, not as a show of force, but as a sign that someone was listening. Local officials who had previously echoed national talking points now spoke candidly in town halls, admitting strain, confusion, and limited resources. These admissions didn't fix anything overnight, but they rebuilt something else: trust. The clip continued to echo, not as sound, but as influence. Inside activist circles, debates turned sharper. Some argued the narrative had been hijacked by fear. Others warned that dismissing legitimate concerns would only harden opposition. The internal fracture grew, not along partisan lines, but philosophical ones. Was the goal to feel morally pure, or to actually manage reality? For years, the answer had been obvious. Now it wasn't. ICE leadership, long accustomed to staying silent, adjusted training language and outreach efforts. They didn't seek applause. They sought legitimacy. Ride-alongs were quietly reopened to journalists willing to observe without preconceived scripts. Community meetings were scheduled, not for speeches, but for listening. These moves didn't trend online, but they mattered offline. The media, sensing a shift, tried to reassert control of the narrative. Long-form articles attempted to reframe the debate, emphasizing historical context and humanitarian responsibility. These pieces were thorough, well-researched, and often sincere. But they struggled to recapture the emotional ground that had already shifted. Facts alone couldn't compete with lived experience. At the same time, migrants themselves became part of the conversation in unexpected ways. Interviews surfaced showing frustration, confusion, and broken expectations. Many admitted they had been promised support systems that didn't exist. Some expressed regret. Others expressed determination. But nearly all described chaos. Their voices complicated the moral simplicity that had dominated earlier narratives. Complication unsettles movements built on clarity. Social platforms adjusted algorithms, quietly reducing the spread of inflammatory rhetoric from all sides. The effect was subtle but noticeable. Conversations slowed. Threads became longer. People read more before responding. The temperature dropped just enough to allow reflection. Not agreement, but reflection. Then came the data. Independent analysts released reports showing the financial impact of unmanaged migration on local budgets. The numbers weren't used as weapons. They were presented as realities. Education costs, healthcare strain, housing shortages, law enforcement overtime. These weren't moral arguments. They were math. And math doesn't bend to ideology. The reports circulated widely, often shared alongside the original clip, as if the monologue had opened the door and the data had walked through it. Together, they formed a narrative harder to dismiss. One based not on fear or virtue, but on consequence. Celebrities faced a choice. Some doubled down, insisting the criticism proved their courage. Their statements grew sharper, more defiant. But the applause they expected didn't arrive. Instead, they were met with questions. Polite ones. Persistent ones. The kind that don't trend but don't go away. Either. Others went quiet. A few adjusted their messaging, shifting from absolutes to acknowledgments. They spoke about complexity, about the need for balance, about listening to impacted communities. These statements didn't go viral, but they were received better. The era of applause for activism was giving way to scrutiny for claims. In Washington, legislative drafts changed tone. Enforcement was no longer treated as a dirty word. Border security was framed not as cruelty, but as structure. Compassion was paired with capacity. Assistance with accountability. The language was careful, deliberate, aware that audiences were listening differently now. The clip had changed the lens. But change invites resistance. Protests erupted in some cities, smaller than in years past, but louder in rhetoric. Signs accused critics of dehumanization. Chants demanded moral clarity. The passion was real, but the crowd felt thinner. Some longtime activists noticed familiar faces missing. People who once marched had chosen disengagement over confrontation. Fatigue had claimed them. On the other side, counter-protests remained restrained. No celebration. No triumph. Just signs asking questions. Asking for order. Asking for honesty. The contrast was striking. Emotion versus exhaustion. In classrooms, teachers navigated new tensions. Students asked harder questions. Not just what should be done, but how. Not just why borders exist, but what happens when they don't function. The discussions were messy, sometimes uncomfortable, but undeniably alive. This was the ripple effect no one could control. As summer approached, border crossings fluctuated. Policies adjusted. Messaging recalibrated. The system didn't suddenly work, but it began responding. Like a machine grinding back to life after long neglect, uneven but moving. Still, beneath the policy debates and media coverage, a deeper transformation unfolded. People stopped outsourcing their thinking. For years, cultural authority had been centralized in a small group of voices, celebrities, activists, commentators, who told the country what compassion looked like. The clip disrupted that hierarchy. It didn't replace it with another. It dissolved it. Individuals reclaimed the right to weigh values against outcomes. That shift frightened institutions built on moral monopoly. And it energized those who felt dismissed for too long. The story was no longer about a TV segment or an award show. It was about agency. About whether a nation could discuss hard truths without tearing itself apart. About whether empathy and enforcement could coexist. The answer wasn't clear yet. But the question had been asked, openly, publicly, without apology. And once asked, it demanded an answer. Because unresolved questions don't fade. They escalate. And as pressure continued to build, as policies collided with reality, and as the old narratives strained under new scrutiny, the country moved closer to a moment it could no longer postpone. A reckoning not of outrage, but of responsibility. And it was coming faster than anyone expected. Part 4. The reckoning announced itself not with a single event, but with a series of small, undeniable signals that together formed a pattern too clear to ignore. Border numbers shifted in unexpected ways. Not dramatically at first, but consistently enough to catch the attention of analysts who had learned to distrust sudden swings. Enforcement policies, once paralyzed by political fear, began operating with quiet confidence. The system wasn't hardened. It was clarified. For the first time in years, expectations were being communicated plainly. In migrant communities, the change was felt almost immediately. Word traveled fast through informal networks. Rumors gave way to realities. The idea that arrival guaranteed permanent settlement began to fade. The journey, once marketed as a moral inevitability, was being reframed as a legal process again. Not heartless. Structured. That distinction mattered. Advocacy organizations adjusted their tone. Some resisted fiercely, accusing policymakers of capitulation. Others adapted, shifting focus from open-ended encouragement to targeted humanitarian aid within lawful frameworks. The movement fractured further, but from that fracture emerged a more grounded approach, less performative, more operational. Inside federal agencies, morale stabilized. Officers who had spent years second-guessing every action now operated under clearer guidelines. Body language changed. Decisions were made faster. Hesitation, the silent killer of effectiveness, receded. The job was still hard, still dangerous, still controversial, but it was no longer ambiguous. And ambiguity, more than opposition, had been the real enemy. The media struggled to keep pace. Old narratives no longer fit cleanly. Stories framed as moral showdowns fell flat against evolving realities. Viewers recognized the mismatch instinctively. When coverage leaned too heavily on outrage, ratings dipped. When it focused on logistics, outcomes, and lived experiences, attention returned. Editors took note. Long-form reporting made a comeback. Not opinion pieces disguised as facts, but deep dives into systems, funding, coordination, and unintended consequences. These articles didn't trend instantly, but they endured. Shared quietly. Bookmarked. Referenced. They fed a growing appetite for substance over spectacle. Celebrities faced their most difficult moment yet. Silence, once a refuge, became conspicuous. Fans asked questions at events. Interviewers pressed gently but persistently. The old script, speak loudly, receive applause, no longer guaranteed safety. Those who adapted acknowledged limits to their understanding. They spoke less about absolutes and more about trade-offs. Their credibility, though bruised, began to recover. Those who refused to adapt found themselves isolated, speaking into an echo chamber that shrank with each passing week. Political campaigns adjusted strategy midstream. Messaging emphasized competence over virtue. Security over symbolism. Candidates avoided grand moral declarations, favoring practical commitments they could explain and defend. Debates grew less theatrical, more detailed. Not calmer, but more real. Voters responded. Town halls filled. Not with cheers, but with questions. Hard ones. How will this be funded? Who enforces this? What happens when capacity is exceeded? These weren't gotcha moments. They were demands for clarity. And clarity, once demanded, became currency. The clip that started it all was rarely mentioned by name now. It didn't need to be. Its influence had diffused into the bloodstream of discourse. It had shifted the center of gravity. People no longer asked whether enforcement was moral. They asked whether chaos was. And chaos is a question few are willing to defend. At the border, coordination improved between federal, state, and local authorities. Jurisdictional turf wars cooled under pressure from constituents who wanted results, not excuses. Data sharing increased. Redundancies were addressed. Mistakes still happened, but they were confronted rather than concealed. Migrants arriving during this period encountered a system that spoke with one voice instead of many. Expectations were clear. Processes were consistent. Outcomes, while not always favorable, were predictable. Predictability, even when difficult, reduced desperation. Desperation had fueled chaos. Back in cultural spaces, award shows felt different. Speeches were shorter. Political declarations, when made, were careful. Applause was polite, not thunderous. The room sensed the shift. Virtue without depth no longer carried the same weight. This wasn't censorship. It was discernment. The public had learned to listen differently. And then, something unexpected happened. A coalition formed, not formal, not named, but real. Border communities, humanitarian workers, law enforcement officials, economists, and even former activists began collaborating quietly. They didn't agree on everything. They didn't pretend to. But they shared a goal: reduce suffering by reducing dysfunction. This coalition didn't dominate headlines. It didn't chant slogans. It solved problems. Temporary housing was redesigned for transition, not permanence. Legal processing timelines shortened. Support services focused on repatriation assistance as much as resettlement. The system, imperfect but moving, began to breathe. Opposition remained, but it lacked cohesion. Its arguments felt frozen in a moment that had passed. Repeating slogans to an audience that had moved on is like shouting into an empty room. The story had turned. What began as a media flashpoint had become a structural pivot. The country hadn't hardened its heart. It had sharpened its mind. Compassion was no longer measured by how loudly it was declared, but by how effectively it reduced harm. And for the first time in a long while, that reduction seemed possible. But transformation invites a final test. Because systems don't reveal their strength during calm. They reveal it under strain. And that strain was coming. Part 5. The strain arrived suddenly, not as a shock, but as a surge. A convergence of global instability, economic pressure, and seasonal movement sent a new wave toward the border, testing whether the changes taking shape were real or merely rhetorical. This was the moment everything had been building toward. If the system held, the shift would be undeniable. If it failed, the old chaos would return with a vengeance. Early indicators were mixed. Processing centers filled quickly, but they didn't overflow. Communication channels activated without confusion. Protocols that had once existed only on paper were executed in real time. Officers moved with urgency, not panic. Humanitarian staff coordinated instead of clashing. The system bent, but it did not break. That alone marked a turning point. Media crews arrived expecting crisis footage. What they found instead unsettled them. Long lines, yes. Tension, yes. But not disorder, not collapse. Cameras lingered, searching for chaos that refused to appear. The story was harder to tell now. Calm doesn't drive clicks. Stability doesn't trend. Behind the scenes, pressure was intense. Federal agencies faced nonstop scrutiny. Advocacy groups watched closely, ready to pounce on any misstep. Border communities braced themselves, wary of promises they'd heard before. Trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. Yet something felt different. Local leaders reported fewer emergency declarations. Hospitals remained strained but functional. Schools absorbed new students without spiraling. Law enforcement reported fewer flashpoint incidents. None of this meant the problem was solved, but it meant it was being managed. Management, for a long time, had been the missing piece. The political response was cautious. No victory laps. No grand statements. Just updates. Numbers. Adjustments. The absence of triumphalism spoke volumes. Officials understood the fragility of the moment. Overconfidence could undo months of progress. Celebrities, watching from afar, hesitated. Some attempted to re-enter the conversation, reframing earlier positions as misunderstood. The public response was muted. Forgiveness wasn't off the table, but credibility had to be earned now, not assumed. In contrast, voices that had focused on solutions rather than slogans gained traction. Not because they were louder, but because they were useful. The audience had recalibrated its values. Impact outweighed intent. Results mattered more than rhetoric. Migrants themselves noticed the difference most clearly. Stories emerged of clearer information provided before departure. Fewer false promises. More accurate expectations. Some chose not to make the journey at all, deciding the risk no longer aligned with reality. Others arrived prepared for outcomes they once believed impossible. Information changed behavior. This shift didn't eliminate suffering, but it reduced exploitation. Smuggling networks, deprived of easy lies, adapted slowly. Their grip weakened as uncertainty replaced guaranteed narratives. Control returned, incrementally, to institutions rather than criminals. That mattered more than headlines could capture. As weeks passed, data confirmed what had once seemed improbable. Crossings stabilized. Processing times shortened. Repatriation rates increased alongside humanitarian assistance. The balance, long dismissed as unattainable, began to look real. Critics searched for angles. Some warned the calm was temporary. Others argued costs remained too high. These critiques weren't ignored. They were absorbed, addressed. The conversation had matured. Disagreement no longer implied betrayal. That maturity marked the true transformation. At home, dinner table conversations reflected the shift. The tone softened. The volume dropped. People still disagreed, passionately. But fewer accused. More listened. The fear that had once fueled extremes gave way to cautious optimism. The clip that had sparked this chain reaction was now almost mythic. People remembered where they were when they first saw it, not because it was shocking, but because it named something unspoken. It hadn't provided answers. It had demanded them. And answers, slowly, were forming. But every system faces a final question. Can it endure success? Because stability invites complacency. And complacency erodes vigilance. The forces that had thrived on chaos hadn't disappeared. They were waiting, adapting, probing for weakness. The coalition understood this. Plans were revised. Stress tests conducted. Transparency increased. The goal wasn't perfection. It was resilience. A system strong enough to withstand pressure without collapsing into extremes. Then came the announcement. A comprehensive review, bipartisan and public, detailing failures, lessons learned, and next steps. No spin. No grandstanding. Just acknowledgement. The report didn't satisfy everyone. It wasn't meant to. It aimed to anchor reality. The public response surprised even its authors. Approval didn't come in cheers. It came in relief. Relief that someone was finally telling the truth. Relief that the chaos hadn't returned. Relief that compassion and order no longer felt mutually exclusive. But relief is temporary. What matters is permanence. And permanence would be tested next. Part 6. Permanence demanded proof, and proof arrived in the form of endurance. Months passed, then seasons, and the system continued to function without collapsing into spectacle or silence. That alone was revolutionary. What had once been managed through crisis was now governed through process. Boring, deliberate, accountable process. The border no longer dominated headlines daily, and that absence spoke louder than outrage ever had. With stability came reflection. Lawmakers revisited policies not to score points, but to refine mechanisms that had proven effective. Sunset clauses were added. Oversight expanded. Metrics replaced messaging. The work lacked drama, but it produced results, and results were finally what mattered. Inside enforcement agencies, training emphasized discretion paired with clarity. Officers were empowered to act, but also held to standards that were transparent and enforceable. Complaints were investigated openly. Mistakes acknowledged. The narrative of impunity, once weaponized by critics, lost traction in the face of documented accountability. Humanitarian organizations adjusted as well. Many found renewed purpose, no longer trapped between moral absolutism and operational frustration. Aid was targeted, resources tracked, outcomes measured. Helping fewer people well replaced helping many people poorly. The shift was painful, but necessary. The public noticed. Trust, long fractured, began to mend, not because institutions demanded it, but because they earned it. Surveys reflected the change. Confidence in border management rose steadily across ideological lines. Not universal, not uncritical, but real. Celebrities, recalibrating their role, began to step back from policy prescriptions. Some redirected their platforms toward funding services rather than dictating solutions. Others stayed silent, recognizing the limits of their expertise. The age of unquestioned cultural authority had ended, replaced by something more grounded. That evolution rippled outward. Media coverage adapted again, focusing less on outrage and more on evaluation. Successes were reported cautiously. Failures dissected without hysteria. Viewers responded by staying engaged longer, not out of fear, but interest. Information replaced adrenaline. In border communities, the difference was tangible. Businesses reopened. Schools stabilized enrollment. Local budgets regained predictability. The sense of constant emergency faded, replaced by vigilance without panic. Migrants who arrived during this period experienced a system that was firm but fair. The rules were clear, the process transparent, outcomes consistent. Even those denied entry spoke of understanding, if not satisfaction. Clarity reduced despair. Despair had been the true accelerant of suffering. The coalition that had quietly formed solidified into a permanent advisory framework. Not a council of celebrities or ideologues, but practitioners. Border officials, economists, human rights observers, local leaders. Their disagreements were frequent, their debates intense, but their focus aligned. Reduce harm, maintain order, tell the truth. These principles guided decisions more than slogans ever had. Still, shadows remained. Global instability didn't pause. Economic pressures persisted. Political winds shifted. Each election cycle tested resolve. Voices on the extremes waited for opportunity, ready to reignite chaos or dismantle enforcement in the name of purity. But the system had memory now. It remembered what happened when narratives replaced logistics. When applause replaced accountability. That memory acted as ballast, keeping policy grounded even when rhetoric soared. The clip that once sparked outrage now existed as a footnote in a much larger story. Not forgotten, but contextualized. It was no longer about who said it, but what it revealed. A nation had been forced to confront the cost of pretending complexity didn't exist. That confrontation had changed it. By the time the next surge threatened, the response was immediate and measured. Resources deployed, communication activated, adjustments made. The surge passed without becoming a crisis. The proof was undeniable. The model worked. Not perfectly, not forever, but enough. Enough to show that compassion without structure fails, and structure without compassion fractures. Together, they formed something resilient. The public understood this now. And understanding is harder to manipulate than emotion. As the story approached its final chapter, one question remained, not about borders, celebrities, or media, but about legacy. What would endure after attention moved on? Would the lessons hold when memories faded? Would the system remain vigilant when crisis no longer loomed? Those answers would define whether this transformation was temporary or foundational. And that answer would come next. Part 7. The answer arrived not in a moment of drama, but in the quiet certainty of continuation. Years later, when the clip was rarely mentioned and the outrage it once sparked had faded into archives and memory, the system it helped awaken was still standing. Not frozen, not perfect, but functioning. That was the legacy. Borders were no longer treated as symbols to be weaponized or ignored, but as responsibilities to be managed. Enforcement existed without apology, and compassion operated without illusion. The country had learned, painfully and imperfectly, that pretending complexity didn't exist only guaranteed suffering for everyone involved. The lesson endured because it had been earned. Children in border towns grew up without constant emergency sirens. Teachers planned school years without fearing sudden collapses in resources. Hospitals budgeted realistically. Law enforcement worked with clarity instead of caution born from fear. Migrants made decisions based on truth instead of fantasy. Fewer came, but those who did arrived informed. That reduced harm more than any speech ever had. Culturally, something deeper had shifted. Celebrity voices still existed, still spoke, still mattered in their own lanes, but the era of automatic moral authority had ended. Fame was no longer mistaken for expertise. Applause no longer substituted for accountability. The public listened, but it also evaluated. That discernment became permanent. Media followed suit. Outrage lost its grip. Long-form analysis gained ground. Viewers demanded explanations instead of enemies. The marketplace of attention adjusted accordingly. Sensationalism still appeared, but it struggled to dominate a culture that had tasted stability. Politically, the issue of the border transformed from a weapon into a responsibility. Campaigns still argued, but fewer lied. Proposals were judged by feasibility, not purity. The extremes remained loud, but they no longer controlled the conversation. Because the center had found its voice. That voice wasn't dramatic. It didn't chant. It didn't trend every day. It asked questions, demanded answers, and accepted complexity. It rejected the false choice between empathy and order. It understood that systems exist not to signal virtue, but to reduce suffering. The coalition that once formed quietly became institutional memory. Advisory boards evolved. Best practices documented. Failures recorded. Successes refined. What worked stayed. What didn't was discarded. Progress became iterative instead of ideological. And that made all the difference. The clip that began this story remained online, viewed millions of times, referenced occasionally by historians and analysts. Not as a masterpiece, not as prophecy, but as a catalyst. A moment when a country paused long enough to hear an uncomfortable truth. That truth was simple. Reality doesn't care about performance. Reality responds only to action. In the end, there were no villains vanquished, no heroes crowned, no final applause. Just a system that worked better than it had before, and a society wiser for having confronted itself. The story didn't end in triumph. It ended in balance. And sometimes, that is the most durable ending of all.